There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a crowd when something embarrassing happens to a stranger. Not the silence of respect and not the silence of shock. It is the silence that comes just before laughter, the held breath of 200 people deciding all at once that what they are witnessing is funny rather than sad. That silence fell over the Dawson County equipment auction on a Saturday morning in April of 1969, and it fell because of a 22-year-old farmer named Corbett Fairfax who had just raised his own bid. The morning had started the way all auction mornings started in Lexington, Nebraska. Cold air carrying the smell of engine oil and dry grass. Men in work coats standing in clusters, talking about corn prices and late frost, and whether the rain last week had come in time or come too late. The auctioneer worked through the equipment in order, his voice rising and falling in that practiced rhythm that made every piece of machinery sound like something worth wanting, even when it clearly was not. The 1948 Farmall M was the last item of the day, and it sat at the far edge of the auction lot the way a sick animal sits at the edge of a herd, separated, apart. Its red paint had faded over 2 decades into something closer to the color of dried blood. The tires were flat and cracked along their sidewalls. The air cleaner housing held a bird's nest, small and brown and abandoned. Someone at some point had taken a nail and carved a single word into the hood of the machine, pressing hard enough to leave a groove in the metal that no amount of rust could fill. The word was junk. Nobody had bothered to disagree. Corbett stood 10 steps back from the machine and looked at it the way his father had taught him to look at things, not at what was broken, but at what remained. The frame was solid. The block, as far as he could see, showed no cracks. The cast iron of the main body had the density and color of something built to last, and whatever else the years had taken from this machine, they had not taken that. He had been standing there long enough that a stranger passing behind him slowed down and asked, "You know that one?" Corbett did not answer. He was still reading. The auctioneer reached the Farmall M and paused in the way a man pauses before delivering news he is not sure how to frame. "All right, folks, last item of the day. 1948 Farmall M sold as is where is. This one comes from the Alcott estate, been sitting in a barn since 1952. Probably good for parts. Maybe. Do I hear $50? Silence. "Come on, people. $50 for a genuine piece of history." More silence. The auctioneer was beginning to move toward his closing remarks when Corbett Fairfax raised his hand. "50, Corbett said. The auctioneer looked at him with visible surprise. "I have 50. Do I hear 60? He scanned the crowd. Nothing moved. 50 going once, 50 going twice. 75. The voice was Corbett's again. His own voice raising his own bid by $25 against no one. The silence lasted exactly 1 second before it broke into laughter. Not mean laughter, not entirely, but the laughter of 200 people who had just watched a young man do something that defied explanation. The auctioneer, to his credit, recovered quickly. "Sold," he said, bringing the gavel down before Corbett could reconsider, to the young man in the back for $75. "Son, you just bought yourself either a genuine antique or a boat anchor. Hard to say which." More laughter. Corbett was already walking toward the payment table. He counted out $75 in small bills. Ones and fives, mostly the kind of money that accumulates slowly in a coffee can on a kitchen shelf, saved in increments too small to feel significant until suddenly they are. The woman behind the payment table looked at the bills, then at Corbett, then at the receipt she was printing. She said, "You sure about this?" He said, "Yes, ma'am," and took his copy of the receipt without further explanation. It was at the payment table that Leland Mercer found him. Leland Mercer was the John Deere dealer in Lexington, a large man in a clean shirt who always smelled of aftershave and new rubber. He had a handshake that other men described as firm, a voice that carried across parking lots, and opinions about everything from crop rotation to the proper way to back a trailer. He had been selling farm equipment in Dawson County for 15 years, and in that time he had developed a particular talent for knowing which farmers were making decisions they would regret. He planted himself in front of Corbett with the confidence of a man accustomed to being listened to. Corbett Fairfax. Leland's voice was not unkind. That was the thing about Leland Mercer at this point in his life. He was not a cruel man. He genuinely believed he was helping. I watched what just happened over there. You understand what $75 buys you today? That's a down payment on a real tractor, a John Deere, something that actually runs. He gestured toward the parking lot, toward his dealership truck with its logo on the door. I've got a used 4020 on the lot right now, fair price, reasonable terms. I can fix this one, Corbett said. Leland. It was a full laugh, the kind that carries, and several men nearby turned to look. Son, that tractor hasn't run since Harry Truman was in office. The engine is seized solid, guaranteed. The transmission is full of mice. The hydraulics haven't moved in 17 years. You would need $1,000 in parts and 12 months of Sundays just to get that thing to cough. He lowered his voice into something that was probably meant to feel paternal. Listen, your father was a good farmer. God rest him. But you are 22 years old, you have got 80 acres of sandy bottom land, and you just spent most of what you have on something that is not worth 15. That is not farming. That is foolishness. Corbett looked at Leland Mercer, at his clean shirt, at his soft hands, at the easy confidence of a man who had never needed to choose between one kind of wrong and another. My father taught me something, Mr. Mercer, Corbett said. He said the worst thing a man can do is let other people decide what is possible. He stepped around the dealer and continued toward the lot. Behind him, he heard the laughter spreading again through the remaining crowd. He kept walking. He was pulling the receipt from his jacket to check the lot number when a different voice stopped him. Not behind him this time, but beside him, coming from a man who had positioned himself near the Farmall M with a relaxed posture of someone who had been waiting. Burl Van Buren was 35 years old, and he ran a small machine shop on the edge of Lexington. He was not a large man, but he had the kind of build that came from actual work rather than effort. And he looked at things with the evaluating squint of someone who had spent years deciding what things were worth. He looked at the Farmall M the way a buyer at a livestock auction looks at an animal not with affection, but with the particular attention of someone calculating the ratio of value to cost. You know what you just bought, Burl said. Not unkindly, informational. A Farmall M, Corbett said. You know what a Farmall M needs to run again after 17 years in a barn? I have some idea. Burl nodded slowly. Here is what you don't have. You don't have a boring bar for the cylinders. You don't have a crankshaft grinder. You don't have a hydraulic press. That engine is not stuck. It is seized. There is a difference, and the difference is about $800 in machine work. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a business card which he held out between two fingers. When you decide to cut your losses, find me. I'll give you $40 for the scrap. Corbett took the card without looking at it and put it in his pocket. He was climbing into the borrowed truck when Burl called after him, almost as an afterthought, the way a man says something he has been holding back and finally decides to release. You know why nobody bid on that machine. It's not just the condition, it's where it came from. Gareth Alcott, the man who owned it, he died strange. Wife left overnight, didn't say goodbye to a soul, left everything right where it was. People around here say he had a secret. Burl paused. just something to know. Corbett drove home. That night, before he fell asleep, he found himself thinking about those last words in a way he could not entirely account for. To understand what Corbett Fairfax was carrying into that auction, you need to understand where he had come from and what had been taken from him 14 months earlier. Garland Fairfax had farmed the 80 acres along the Platte River bottomland for 20 years with a philosophy that could be summarized in a single sentence: never owe what you cannot pay, and never pay someone else to do what you can learn to do yourself. He was not a wealthy man and did not pretend to be. What he had instead of wealth was competence, a deep, practiced, unhurried competence that extended from soil chemistry to engine mechanics, and that he passed to his son not through formal instruction, but through proximity and repetition. Corbett learned to weld at 12 years old, standing on a crate to reach the workbench, while Garland guided his hands. He learned to read an engine by sound before he could drive, learning that a healthy diesel had a particular rhythm and that deviations from that rhythm were a language requiring translation. By the time he was 16, there was no piece of equipment on the Fairfax farm that Corbett could not disassemble and rebuild. But the lesson Garland taught that mattered most was not technical. They were in the workshop on a winter afternoon, Corbett perhaps 14, and Garland was working on a valve that had stuck in its guide. He had been at it for an hour, patient and methodical, trying each approach in turn without frustration. Corbett asked why he didn't just replace it. Garland looked up. "Because I don't understand why it's stuck yet. If I replace it without understanding, it'll stick again, and I still won't know why." He turned the valve over in his hands. "Every broken machine is talking to you. Friction is it asking for help. Knocking is it giving you a warning. Silence," he said, setting the valve down. "Silence is what a machine sounds like when it is given up." He picked up the valve again. "We don't let machines give up, and we don't give up on machines." Corbett had been 14 when he heard those words and had not fully understood them. He was 22 when he understood them completely, standing in the auction lot in April of 1969, looking at a machine that everyone else had decided was finished. Garland Fairfax died in the spring of 1968, a heart attack on the North Field alone in the morning. He was dead before the ambulance reached the county road. He was 51 years old. What Garland left behind beyond the land and the tools and the accumulated knowledge of 2 decades of farming was a set of debts he had never mentioned to his family. Not large debts, but real ones, the kind that accumulate when equipment fails and crops come in short, and a man decides to handle it quietly rather than worry the people he loves. There was a loan against the tractor repair from the previous fall. There was seed money borrowed against the coming spring. There was the Farmall Super M, the farm's only tractor, which had thrown a rod in October and which Garland had planned to rebuild over the winter parts already ordered, time set aside. He never had the chance. Cornelia Fairfax did not cry at the funeral. She stood at the grave in the late March cold and held herself with the contained stillness of a woman who understood that grief was a thing to be honored, but not indulged, not yet, not while there was work requiring attention. It was the week after the funeral that she sat down with Corbett at the kitchen table and opened Garland's account book to the first page. "We have 6 months before the bank calls," she said, her voice carrying the same flatness she used for weather reports and grocery lists. "The Super M is down. Without a tractor in the ground by May, we don't plant. If we don't plant, we don't pay. If we don't pay..." She did not finish that sentence. She did not need to. Corbett wanted to repair the Super M. He knew the engine, knew the parts, knew what needed to happen. Cornelia's question was not whether he could do it, but whether he could do it in time. "If I find the parts 2 months," he said, "and if you don't find them..." He had no answer for that. They argued quietly and without resolution, and then the practical reality of spring planting ended the argument the way spring planting ends most arguments in farming country, by arriving regardless of what anyone had decided. Corbett borrowed a tractor from Thaddeus Stanwyck, the neighbor to the north, one of the few men in the area who was still willing to extend that kind of courtesy after Garland's debts became locally known. He got through the spring planting and then the summer and then the fall, always behind, always borrowing, always calculating the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. By the following spring, with another season borrowed, and behind him, Corbett had $75 in a coffee can and a trip to an auction where, if he was lucky, something worth fixing might be selling for less than it was worth. He had been luckier than he expected, though luck was not quite the right word for what had happened. 4 men were needed to push the Farmall M onto the borrowed flatbed trailer because the wheels would not roll and the steering was frozen solid. The men did not say much. One of them, a farmer named Dave Pritchard, who owed Garland Fairfax a favor from 3 years back and was settling it now, looked at the machine and then at Corbett and then back at the machine. He did not say what he was thinking. He pushed when they needed pushing and stopped when they needed stopping, and when it was done, he went back to his truck without commentary. The machine went into the Fairfax workshop, and Corbett spent the first night standing in front of it with a lantern and a notepad. He worked systematically the way his father had taught him, not with the frantic energy of someone trying to prove something, but with the deliberate attention of someone trying to understand. He moved around the machine clockwise, noting each system in turn, recording what he could see and what he suspected. The damage was extensive. He had known it would be extensive, but extensive and hopeless were different categories, and his father had taught him to distinguish carefully between them. It was when he reached the engine that he found the first thing that did not fit. He located the drain plug on the oil pan, positioned a catch pan beneath it, and opened the drain. He had expected sludge, the dense tar-like residue of oil that has been sitting undisturbed for 17 years, breaking down slowly in the heat and cold cycles of a Nebraska barn. What came out instead was dark and thick. Yes, but it flowed. It had not fully degraded. He caught some on his finger and brought it to his nose. It did not have the sour, rancid smell of oil long gone past its usefulness. More surprising than the condition of the oil was the quantity. The pan was full, not low, not partially depleted, but full, as though someone had added fresh oil to this engine not long before parking it. And when he examined the pan mounting more carefully, running his finger along the seam where it met the block, he felt the slight raised edge of a sealant. Compound, something applied deliberately, something that had kept moisture and air from reaching the interior of the crankcase for the better part of 2 decades. Corbett crouched there for a long moment. He wrote in his notepad, "Oil, fresh sealed wine." He continued his inspection. There was more to learn, and his questions could wait. 6 weeks into the restoration, Burl Van Buren appeared at the workshop door. He came without announcement, walking in from the farm road, with the unhurried gait of a man who considers himself welcome in most places. He stood in the doorway and looked at the workshop floor where the engine components were laid out in careful sequence, each one tagged with a handwritten label indicating its position, its condition, and what it needed. It was the kind of organization that costs time, the kind a man only undertakes if he is planning to put things back together. Burl walked to the center of the floor and crouched over a piston, turning it in his hands. "Cylinder walls are scored," he said, not cruelly, as fact. "You need a boring bar." He set the piston down and stood up. "You don't have a boring bar." "I know," Corbett said. "I'll go to 55 right now. You can use that 55 toward a start on something that works." The answer is still no. Burl looked at the organized components, then at Corbett. "You are a stubborn person." "Probably." Burl walked toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame, turning back with something that looked briefly like genuine curiosity rather than business calculation. "That weld on the oil pan, you see it?" Corbett said nothing. "I've seen that kind of weld before. That's not repair work. Someone built something onto this machine, added something that wasn't there when it came from the factory. Whatever they didn't want found, they put it there." He let that sit for a moment. "Just thought you should know what you're dealing with." Then he was gone. Corbett stood in the quiet of the workshop for a long time after Burl's truck disappeared down the road. He looked at the engine components on the floor, at the oil pan with its careful sealant, at the weld line he had already noted weeks ago on the underside of the crankcase. He got his notepad and found the line he had written. "Oil fresh, sealed, why?" He wrote a second line beneath it. "Weld non-factory modification, what was added?" 2 questions. 1 machine. And somewhere in the county, a woman named Cornelia Fairfax was watching the calendar and counting the distance between now and May. He put the notepad in his shirt pocket and kept working. It was 3 months after the auction when the library gave him another piece of the puzzle he had not known he was assembling. He had gone to the Lexington Public Library on a Tuesday carrying a list of books he needed, manuals and technical guides, and a machinist's handbook he had found referenced in a farmall service document. The librarian, a woman of perhaps 60 named Hazel Pruitt, watched him present his list with the attention of someone who had spent 40 years paying close notice to what people needed to know and why. "You're fixing something," she said. It was not a question. "Farmall M48. Hazel Pruitt was quiet for one beat. "Alcott Place." "Yes, ma'am." "I've been at this library since 1944, she said, pulling the first book from the shelf behind her. "Gareth Alcott used to come in here, quiet man, came in once a month, always returned what he borrowed on time, always said please and thank you." She stamped the book and set it on the counter. "Died in 52, heart, they said. Wife left inside of a week, middle of the night, left everything exactly where it was." She pulled the second book. "People had opinions about why. They usually do." She set the stack on the counter and looked at him directly. "Take your time with these. Return them when you're finished." Corbett walked out of the library with a stack of technical manuals and a fact that had now come to him from 2 separate directions. Gareth Alcott had left something behind that people talked about still 17 years later in a town where people had better things to discuss. That evening he came back to the workshop after dark. Cornelia was already in bed. He stood alone with the lantern and the disassembled engine and the 2 questions in his notepad. He was cleaning the underside of the engine block, preparing to take measurements for the cylinder bore, when the lamplight caught something he had missed. Along the seam where the crankcase met the main block, there was a line of welding. He had seen it before and noted it, but tonight, with the lamplight at a different angle, he could see something he had not noticed before. The weld was not along the seam. It was 6 inches below the seam, along the lower wall of the crankcase itself. That was not a repair weld. A repair weld follows damage. This weld ran in a straight, deliberate line, as though someone had cut into the wall of the crankcase and then closed it again, creating something inside, adding to the internal geometry of a space that was supposed to be simple, functional, unremarkable. Burl Van Buren had been right. Someone had built something into this machine. Corbett sat down on the workshop stool and looked at the crankcase in the lamplight for a long time. He thought about Gareth Alcott, who had died in 1952 after carefully sealing the oil in this engine, who had a wife who left in the night, who had a secret that people still talked about in 1969. He thought about Burl Van Buren's casual certainty and Hazel Pruitt's careful neutrality. He thought about the question he had written in his notepad weeks ago and not been able to answer. He would answer it eventually. He knew that. The machine would tell him what it was hiding, the same way every machine told you its truth if you were patient enough and thorough enough to listen. But the machine was not running yet, and the field needed planting, and May was coming whether he was ready or not. He put the lantern out and walked to the house. That night, Cornelia was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she had not touched. She looked up when he came in. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You working late," she said finally. "Not a question. Found something I want to think about." She nodded, and for a moment there was something in her expression that was not quite worry and not quite curiosity. "Corbett," she said, "do you know anything about the Alcott family?" He looked at her. "Why," she wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Your father knew Gareth Alcott, not well, but they talked at the feed store sometimes. I remember once your father came home quieter than usual. Wouldn't say why." She paused. "That was sometime in 51 or 52. I never knew what they talked about." Corbett stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at his mother in the yellow kitchen light. "You knew something was different about that machine," he said. "When I brought it home, you didn't say anything, but you knew." Cornelia looked at the untouched coffee. "I knew your father respected Gareth Alcott in a way he didn't explain. I knew the tractor came from his estate. The rest," she said, standing and carrying the cup to the sink, "is probably nothing." She paused at the doorway to the hall. "Fix the machine, Corbett. Whatever questions you have can wait until spring. The calendar can't." She went to bed. Corbett stood in the kitchen alone. She had not answered his question. He was certain, in the way you become certain about things that cannot yet be proven, that she had not answered his question very deliberately. He went to bed with 3 questions instead of 2, and the understanding that at least one person in his life knew more than she was saying about a dead man's secret that had been sitting in his workshop for the last 3 months, waiting in the dark inside a machine that everyone else had already given up on. The engine started on the 3rd try, not the 1st, not the 2nd. On the 1st attempt, the starter motor groaned and the crankshaft moved exactly 1/4 turn before stopping. On the 2nd, it moved further 3 full rotations before the compression held it. On the 3rd, in the gray light of an April morning in 1972, with frost still on the workshop windows, and Corbett Fairfax's hands trembling on the controls, the engine caught. It did not purr, it did not hum. It erupted, rough and enormous and immediate, a sound like a fist hitting a table, and then it found its rhythm cylinders firing in sequence, the way they were designed to fire, and the roughness smoothed itself out as the oil moved through passages it had not traveled in 20 years, as metal parts found the tolerances. They were built to maintain as a machine that had been silent since 1952, remembered in whatever way machines remember what it was made to do. Corbett sat in the seat and did not move. He had not planned what he would feel. He had been so focused on the sequence of problems one after another for 3 years, each one solved, revealing the next one waiting, that he had never allowed himself to imagine the moment of completion. And so when it arrived without preparation, and what he felt was not triumph, not vindication, not the satisfaction of having proved anyone wrong. What he felt was grief. Because the person who should have been standing in the doorway of that workshop, hearing this engine turn over for the first time, was Garland Fairfax. And Garland Fairfax was 4 years in the ground in the Lexington Cemetery, and he was never going to hear this, and the engine running was both the best thing Corbett had done in his life and the thing that made his father's absence more absolute than it had ever been. He sat in the seat until the tears stopped. Then he looked at his hands, the same hands Garland had guided over a welding torch at age 12. The same shape, the same knuckles, the same pattern of calluses in the same places. He had noticed this once before, shaking his father's hand after a long day, the strange doubling of seeing your own hand in someone else's. He thought of that now in the rumble of the engine, and it was enough. He drove the machine out of the workshop into the morning. Leland Mercer was on the county road. He was driving back from an early call at a customer's place 7 miles north, which was the only reason he was on that particular stretch of road at that particular hour. And he saw the Farmall M come out of the Fairfax workshop under its own power, and he saw Corbett Fairfax in the seat, and even at road distance, he could see that Corbett's face was wet. Leland did not stop. He did not slow down, did not roll down his window, did not acknowledge what he had just witnessed in any way. He pressed the accelerator and continued down the road at a speed slightly higher than necessary. He was 3 miles away before he realized he was gripping the steering wheel harder than the road required. He had been wrong. He had stood in a public place and told a 22-year-old boy in front of 200 people that what he was attempting was foolishness, that his dead father would have been ashamed of him, and he had been completely and demonstrably wrong. The machine was running. 3 years after every sensible person in Dawson County had written it off, the machine was running, and there was nothing left to say about that. Leland Mercer drove home and did not say anything to anyone about what he had seen. But he did not forget it either. Back at the Fairfax farm, Cornelia had come out onto the porch. Corbett did not know how long she had been standing there. He had driven the Farmall M into the middle of the near field, the field Garland used to call the kitchen garden, because it was the one closest to the house, and he had shut the engine off and then started it again 3 times just to be certain. When he looked up, the 4th time, Cornelia was on the porch in her work coat watching him. Not the machine. Him. She nodded once. A single deliberate motion of her head, the kind that carried weight precisely because it was not accompanied by words or gestures, or the softening additions people use when they are not sure their meaning will land. Just the nod, and then she turned and went back inside. From Cornelia Fairfax, who did not give approval lightly and did not perform it at all, that nod was everything. Now let me tell you about the years between the engine starting and the discovery, because most people, when they hear this story, want to jump straight from the triumph of 1972 to the secret found in 1985. But the 13 years in between are not nothing. They are where the real education happened, and you cannot understand what Corbett did with what he found if you do not understand who he had become by the time he found it. From 1972 to 1977, Corbett farmed his 80 acres with the Farmall M and did not buy a new tractor. While other farmers in Dawson County were taking out loans to upgrade their equipment, following the advice of dealers and agricultural extension agents who told them that bigger was better and that debt was just leverage waiting to pay off, Corbett Fairfax was paying down what his father had left behind and setting aside whatever remained. He lived tightly. He worked long. He fixed things himself and charged fair prices when neighbors brought their equipment to him, which they began doing with increasing frequency once word spread that he could solve problems other mechanics called unsolvable. His teacher in the years after the engine victory was Thaddeus Stanwyck. Thaddeus was 63 years old in 1972, with 50 years of farming the same bottomland behind him, and he had watched Corbett struggle through borrowed seasons with the quiet attentiveness of a man who knows something useful but is waiting to be asked. The exchange happened in the summer of 1974 when Thaddeus came to the Fairfax workshop with his grain drill and a look of deliberate awkwardness on his face. "I want to pay you for the work you did on my combine last fall," Thaddeus said. He was a man who found most social transactions uncomfortable, and this one was more uncomfortable than most. "You lent me your equipment for 2 planting seasons when nobody else would," Corbett said. "We're not close to even. I don't want to owe." "You don't owe, I owe." Thaddeus stood there with his hands in his pockets, working through the problem of a debt he could not discharge with money. "Then let me give you something worth having," he said finally. "Not money, knowledge." What Thaddeus taught Corbett over the next 2 years had nothing to do with engines. It had to do with reading the land itself, the way moisture moved through the particular clay and sand mix of Platte River bottomland, the indicators in the soil's color and texture that told you what it needed before it told you through reduced yield, the rotation patterns that kept land productive across decades rather than exhausting it in 5. Garland Fairfax had been a good farmer. Thaddeus Stanwyck showed Corbett how to be a better one. "You know machines," Thaddeus told him one evening at the edge of the east field. "That's worth a lot, but the machine serves the land. You have to know both." Corbett listened. He had learned in the years since his father's death that the people worth listening to were the ones who waited to be asked. It was in the summer of 1977 that Corbett had the only moment of genuine doubt in the entire story of the Farmall M. A man named Marcus Webb drove out from Omaha on a Tuesday in July. He was in his mid-40s, well-dressed for farm country, driving a truck that cost more than most of the equipment in Corbett's workshop. He had heard about the Farmall M through the loose network of agricultural collectors who tracked significant restorations, and he wanted to make an offer. He offered $3,500. Corbett held the check in his hand for a long moment. It was made out in his name, the numbers already written, the signature already applied. In 1977, $3,500 was a year's profit from the farm delivered in a single transaction for a machine that had cost him $75 in 3 years of weekends. He stood in the workshop and looked at the machine, and then at the check, and then at the machine again. The doubt was not about money. He had enough, barely, but enough. The doubt was something he could not have articulated cleanly at that moment, but understood clearly in its emotional texture. He had begun at some point without noticing to think of this machine as something other than a tool. He had begun to treat it the way his father had treated the land, as something that required his particular care, as though the relationship between the machine and himself was not incidental but necessary. That concerned him, because his father had also taught him the difference between a tool and a purpose. You served the purpose. The tool served you. When you started serving the tool, you had confused the direction of things. He gave the check back to Marcus Webb without explanation. Webb looked at him for a moment. "There's not a better offer coming," he said. "I know," Corbett said. Webb shook his head with the expression of a man who has encountered an irrational actor and cannot determine the appropriate response. He drove back to Omaha. Corbett went back to work. But the question he had asked himself that afternoon, the question of why he was keeping this machine, stayed with him in a way he could not resolve. He did not yet have the answer. The answer, as it turned out, was still 8 years away, sealed inside a hidden chamber he did not yet know existed. By 1982, Corbett's reputation as a mechanic had reached the point where Leland Mercer was sending customers to him. This was not announced. Leland did not call Corbett and tell him what he was doing. Corbett found out the way you find out most things in a small county, from a neighbor who mentioned it without realizing it was news. A farmer named Carl Briggs came in with a broken tractor and said matter-of-factly that Leland Mercer had told him Corbett was the only man in the county who could fix it. Corbett was quiet for a moment after Carl said that. He thought about a Saturday morning in 1969, about 200 people laughing about the particular confidence with which Leland Mercer had predicted his failure. He thought about the check he had returned to Marcus Webb and the Farmall M still running in the corner of his workshop after 10 years of daily use. He took the tractor in and fixed it. He did not say anything to Carl about Leland. Some acknowledgments do not need to be spoken to be received. Then came 1985, and everything that had been building for 16 years began to move at once. The farm crisis of the 1980s hit Dawson County the way a hard frost hits in May, late enough that people had stopped expecting it early enough to destroy what was already growing. Interest rates that had been high for years finally reached the point where the debt farmers had been carrying became mathematically unmanageable. Land values dropped. Commodity prices dropped. The foreclosure notices started appearing on mailboxes along roads where Corbett had driven his whole life in front of farms belonging to families he had known since childhood. Leland Mercer was drowning. His dealership had sold on credit through the boom years, and now the loans were going bad, and the repossessed equipment was worth half what was owed on it, and the bank was asking questions that Leland did not have good answers for. He was 63 years old and watching everything he had built over 30 years come apart in a season. On an evening in May of 1985, he drove to the Fairfax farm. Corbett was in the workshop replacing a hydraulic seal on a neighbor's baler when he heard the truck on the gravel. He did not look up immediately. He heard the truck door, heard footsteps, heard the footsteps stop at the workshop door. Then silence. He looked up. Leland Mercer was standing in the doorway with his hat in both hands. He was wearing a work shirt instead of the pressed shirts Corbett associated with him, and he looked like a man who had not been sleeping well. He looked for the first time in the 22 years Corbett had known him by sight, like someone who was not sure of his welcome. Neither man spoke for a moment. Corbett set down his tools and wiped his hands. "Leland," he said finally. "Corbett." A pause. "That farm all." Leland nodded toward the corner where the M sat. "Still running." "Every day." Leland looked at the machine for a long moment. 16 years, he said. Not to Corbett specifically, to the heir or to himself, or to whatever accounting system he kept internally. Then he looked back. "I have 3 tractors on my lot. Engine problems on all 3. My mechanics can't solve them. The factory wants more than the machines are worth to look at them." He stopped, looked at his hat. "Everyone I ask tells me the same name." Corbett waited. "I told you in front of a lot of people that your father would have been ashamed of what you did that day at the auction." Leland's voice was level but not comfortable. "I said it to make a point, and I said it in public, and I was wrong." He looked up. "Not just about the machine, about a lot of things. I put farmers in this county into debt they couldn't carry because I was selling product and calling it advice. I told men who trusted me that expansion was sound when what I was really telling them was that my commission was real." He stopped again. "I am not sleeping." The workshop was quiet. Outside, the evening air moved through the fields. Corbett had carried this moment in some form for 16 years. The idea of what he would say to Leland Mercer if Leland ever stood in front of him with his hat in his hands. He had imagined versions of it in the way you imagine things you do not expect to happen, turning them over late at night, finding the words that would close the distance between what was done and what was fair. Now that the moment was here, the words he had imagined felt wrong. Not because they were untrue, but because Leland, standing in this doorway, already knew everything Corbett might have said, and saying it would only be adding weight to a man who was already down. "Bring the tractors over," Corbett said. "I'll look at them. Standard rate, same as anyone else." He picked up his tools. "We are not friends, Leland. But it is not the time to hold the past above the work." Leland Mercer left, and that night Cornelia sat across from Corbett at the kitchen table and said something she had never said before, not once in all the years since Garland died. "I watched you with Leland Mercer this evening," she said. "You forgave him without making him ask twice. That is what your father would have done." She said it simply, without sentimentality, and then changed the subject. But Corbett sat with it a long time after she had gone to bed. Now let me tell you about the fall of 1985, because this is where the story takes its final and unexpected turn. Corbett's annual autumn maintenance on the Farmel M was not a casual process. It was a ritual, methodical, and thorough, the same sequence every year since 1972. Checking each system, measuring tolerances, replacing anything that showed wear before it became failure. He knew this machine the way a surgeon knows a particular anatomy, every bolt, every seal, every clearance, every sound. This year, during the inspection of the engine block, he found something he had not seen before. It was a hairline crack, barely visible, running along the lower portion of the block near the rear main bearing journal. He had to use a flashlight and a magnifying glass to be certain it was there. And when he was certain, he sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long time. A crack like that started small and grew. It would not kill the engine today or next month, but it would kill it eventually, and by the time it was obvious, it would be too late for anything but replacement. He spent a week searching for a replacement block. They were genuinely scarce. The 1948 Farmel M had been out of production for decades, and most of the blocks that still existed were already installed in machines or sitting in salvage yards in pieces. He found one at a yard in Salina, Kansas, and arranged to have it shipped. While he waited, he made the decision that would change everything. He had rebuilt this engine before, but never completely. There had always been something in place, some component he worked around rather than remove some shortcut taken in the interest of time. This time, with a replacement block coming and nothing to lose, he was going to take the engine completely apart. Not to repair it, to understand it fully for the first time the way his father had stood at a workbench with a stuck valve and refused to replace it until he knew why it had stuck. He started at the top and worked down, documenting everything, drawing diagrams in a fresh notebook, measuring dimensions he had never measured because he had never needed to. The work took 2 weeks of evenings. He was thorough in a way that felt, he would later say, almost ceremonial, as though he understood, without being able to say why, that this was a farewell as much as an inspection. It was on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks into the teardown, that he removed the crankcase completely from the block for the first time. He set it on the workbench under the bright overhead light, and he measured it. The external dimensions matched the specifications in his service manual exactly. But the internal dimensions did not. There was a discrepancy of almost 2 inches along the interior depth of the lower crankcase wall. 2 inches that the specifications said should not be there. 2 inches of space that in a correctly dimensioned crankcase simply did not exist. Corbett set his measuring instruments down. He turned the crankcase over and looked at its underside. And there, in the direct overhead light, he could now see the full truth of what he had glimpsed only partially in the lamplight. Of 1969, the weld line ran in a deliberate horizontal path across the lower interior wall, sealing a chamber between itself and the original outer wall of the casting. A secondary plate fabricated and welded into place from the inside. A hidden compartment, sealed for 33 years. And he had been driving this machine for 16 of them without knowing it was there. His hands were steady when he picked up the cutting tool. He did not know why he expected them to shake. He had found hidden things before, problems concealed within machines. Failures waiting in places you did not think to look. This was different only in that someone had put it there deliberately with care, with the intention that it remain hidden until someone took the machine entirely apart. He cut along the weld line. The secondary wall came free. Inside the space, wrapped in oilcloth that had remained dry for 3 decades because the crankcase around it had been sealed against moisture, there was a leather pouch. It was stiff with age but intact. He carried it to the workbench and opened it with hands that were, after all, not entirely steady. He counted the money 3 times because the first count did not seem real, and the second count confirmed the first, and the third count confirmed the second. $3,200. In bills no newer than 1951. Beneath the money, folded twice and wrapped in a separate piece of oilcloth, was a document, a land deed, 40 acres in Frontier County, dated 1949, signed by Gareth Alcott. And beneath the deed, in an envelope, sealed with wax that had held for 33 years, was a letter. Corbett looked at the three items arranged on his workbench: the money, the deed, the letter. Outside the workshop, the autumn wind moved through the fields, and somewhere down the county road a dog was barking at something in the dark. He looked at the clock on the workshop wall. It was 11:40 at night. He put the letter in his shirt pocket. He put the money and the deed back in the leather pouch. He turned off the workbench light, walked to the workshop door, locked it behind him, and went inside to bed. He lay in the dark for an hour before it occurred to him that he had not opened the letter. And then he understood why some things needed daylight. Some things you should not read in the middle of the night alone, when the world outside is too quiet and too dark and too large. Some things needed to be read in the morning at the kitchen table, with coffee, in the ordinary light of a day that had not yet been changed by what you were about to know. He put his hand over his shirt pocket, feeling the envelope through the fabric. Gareth Alcott, dead since 1952. A man his father had known well enough to come home quieter than usual. A man whose wife had fled in the night. A man who had sealed his best machine's oil and built a hidden room inside its crankcase and put something in it that he had carried alone for years before his heart gave out. Tomorrow, Corbett would know what it was. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep for a long time. The letter was 4 pages long, written in the careful hand of a man who had composed it many times in his head before committing it to paper. Corbett read it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning in October of 1985, with coffee going cold beside him and the early light coming through the east window, the way it had come through that window every morning of his life. He read it once straight through without stopping. Then he set it down and looked at the wall for a while. Then he picked it up and read it again. Gareth Alcott had written the letter in November of 1952, 5 days before his heart stopped. He had known he was dying. The doctor had told him plainly, and Gareth had spent those 5 days doing what a man does when he has carried something alone for too long and understands he will not have another chance to put it down. The letter explained everything. In October of 1951, the First National Bank of Curtis had been robbed. 2 men with guns had taken $8,000 from the vault on a Tuesday morning and driven west in a pickup truck. The sheriff's office had sent deputies in pursuit, and the story had been in the Lexington paper for 3 days before being replaced by other stories, the way all stories eventually are. What the paper never reported was what happened on Route 6, approximately 11 miles west of Curtis, at roughly 2 in the afternoon on the day of the robbery. Gareth Alcott had been driving home from the feed store. He had seen a pickup truck stopped at the roadside with its hood up, 2 men standing beside it with the visible frustration of people whose transportation has failed them at the worst possible moment. Gareth had done what men on rural roads did in 1951. He had stopped to help. He had not known who they were. He had not recognized them. He was 50 yards away, walking toward them with his hands in his pockets, when the canvas bag in the truck bed split along a seam that had been under too much stress, and the contents shifted, and through the gap, he saw the paper bands of bundled currency. Bank-banded currency, the kind you only saw in quantity. You worked at a bank or had just taken something from one. The 2 men saw him see it. One of them reached for something in his jacket. And then at a distance of perhaps 30 yards, a car came around the bend. A family, a husband and wife, and 3 children, visible through the window, slowing because 2 vehicles were stopped and the road was narrow. The men looked at the family car, looked at Gareth, made the calculation that a shooting in front of witnesses was a different category of problem than a shooting without them, and ran into the field through the fence, gone. Gareth stood at the roadside with his heart slamming against his ribs, looking at the disabled truck and the split bag and the money on the truck bed floor. The family in the car had slowed to a stop, and the husband was leaning out the window asking if everything was all right. Gareth told him everything was fine, thanked him, waited for the car to continue. Then he took the money. He wrote in the letter, "Without evasion, I took it. I knew what it was, and I took it. My wife had been ill for 2 years, and the doctor's bills were real, and I told myself God had answered a prayer I was too ashamed to pray out loud. I told myself I would decide what to do with it after I was home and had time to think. I told myself a lot of things that I believed for about 2 hours. The amount left in the truck after the two men had taken what they could carry was $6,400. Gareth drove home with it under the seat. He put it in the barn. He did not tell his wife. He had intended to spend it gradually, carefully, in ways that would not attract attention. That intention lasted 3 days, at which point he could not look at the money without feeling physically ill. He put it in a box. He put the box in the corner of the barn behind the feed sacks. He did not touch it. 4 months later, in February of 1952, he read in the paper that the two men had been arrested in Casper, Wyoming, with approximately $1,500 still in their possession. The bank's insurance had covered the loss. The case was closed. Nobody was looking for the rest of the money. Nobody was looking for Gareth Alcott. He wrote, "I thought closing the case would make it easier. It made it worse, because now there was no mechanism by which I could give it back without explaining where I had gotten it. And I found I was a man who had not stolen for greed, but had stolen from fear, and was now too afraid to make it right." He had kept the money for 9 months before finding the one use for it he could tolerate. There was a family in Frontier County named Garner. Gareth knew them slightly, the way farmers in adjacent counties know one another by reputation and by the occasional meeting at equipment shows or grain elevators. The Garners had 40 acres of good bottomland that they were about to lose to the bank after 3 consecutive bad harvests. They were not careless people. They were not lazy people. They had simply run out of room between what the land could produce and what the debt required. Gareth hired a lawyer in North Platte, a man he did not know, and who did not know him, and through that lawyer he purchased the Garner farm at the bank's asking price, paying in cash, using a mechanism that kept his name off the transaction as seen from the Garner side. He then arranged again through the lawyer for the Garner family to remain on the land as tenants with no rent obligations. The deed went into Gareth's name. The family stayed. They thought they had been saved by some anonymous act of institutional mercy or clerical error, and Gareth never corrected that belief. The remaining $3,200 he could not spend and could not return and could not destroy. So he built a room for it inside the best machine he owned, and he sealed it in, and he sealed the oil in around it to protect the engine from the inside, and he drove the machine for 1 more year until his heart made clear it was not going to last a decade. In the final paragraph of the letter he wrote, "I do not know who will find this. I may have been wrong to hide it rather than face what I did. I was not a brave man when it mattered. What I know is that the machine will eventually go to someone who takes it seriously enough to understand it completely. A man who does not take things apart to the end does not find what is at the bottom. Whoever you are, you earn the right to know this. What you do with it is yours to decide. I hope you are better at deciding than I was." Gareth Alcott, November 14th, 1952. Corbett set the letter down and looked out the window at the field. He was 38 years old, and he had just read a confession written by a man he had never met, who had died 33 years ago, who had hidden a secret inside a machine that everyone else in Dawson County had decided was worthless, and who had trusted without knowing who or when or whether anyone would that the right person would eventually find it. He sat at that table for a long time. The first thing he did was nothing. He sat with it for a week, turning it over the way his father turned, stuck valves, not forcing it, waiting until he understood. He went to church on Sunday and sat in the same pew he had sat in since childhood, and did not pray for guidance so much as he prayed for clarity, which is a different thing. Guidance asks someone else to decide. Clarity asks for enough light to see what you already know. He told Cornelia on Monday evening. She listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of her, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you remember when you were 14 and your father found $20 in the lining of a coat he bought at a church rummage sale?" Corbett remembered. "He asked you what he should do with it," she said. "You told him to find whoever sold the coat and give it back. And he asked, 'What if you can't find them?' And you said, 'Then use it for something that helps someone.'" Corbett looked at his mother. She was 71 years old, and she had the clear eyes of someone who had been watching carefully for a long time. "You already know what you're going to do," she said. "You've known since you read the letter. You're just waiting to feel certain." She was right. The legal question required answering first because Corbett was not a man who moved forward without understanding what he was standing on. He went to see Wendell Coburn on a Wednesday. Wendell Coburn was 68 years old and had been in law enforcement in this county for 4 decades. He was retiring in the spring. When Corbett walked into his office and set the money, the deed, and the letter on his desk, Coburn looked at each item in turn with the attentiveness of a man sorting through a problem he had been handed before and not been able to solve. "I was a deputy in 51, Coburn said after reading the letter to the end. "I know this case. The numbers never added up. $3,200 unaccounted for. We assumed the suspects had it hidden somewhere, and we just never found it." He folded the letter carefully. Gareth Alcott. He said the name quietly as though he was filing it somewhere internal. "I always thought he was a decent man." "He was trying to be," Corbett said. Coburn leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Technically, this is property connected to a criminal act. The bank was made whole by insurance in 1952. The bank itself no longer exists. The men who committed the robbery served their sentences and have been dead for years." "I know all of that." "Then tell me what path I take to handle this correctly." Coburn looked at him for a long moment. This was the distinction that mattered to the sheriff. Corbett could see it in the way the older man was watching him, the distinction between a person who comes seeking permission and a person who comes seeking a way to do what is right. They look similar on the surface. They are entirely different underneath. "There is a property attorney in Lincoln named Robert Garfield," Coburn said. "He handles unusual estate situations, cases where title is complicated by age or circumstance." He wrote the name on a notepad and slid it across the desk. "I will make a call before you get there. The conversation will go more smoothly." He stood and offered his hand. Corbett shook it. "Gareth Alcott spent 33 years carrying something he shouldn't have had to carry alone," Coburn said. "It is good that someone finally knows the whole story." He paused at the door of his own office. "Corbett, whatever you decide to do with it, I think you're going to decide right." 2 months of legal work in Lincoln produced the clarity Corbett had needed. The statute of limitations had passed by decades. The original institution no longer existed in any form that could receive restitution. The money under the specific circumstances documented in Gareth Alcott's letter and supported by the historical record of the robbery and its resolution was determined to have no legally actionable claimant. Robert Garfield was careful and thorough, And when he finished, he looked at Corbett across his desk and said, "You are free to use it as you see fit." On the drive home from Lincoln, Corbett pulled over on a county road and sat with the engine running for a while. Free to use it as you see fit. Gareth Alcott had said something different. He had said, "Whoever you are, you earn the right to know this. What you do with it is yours to decide. I hope you are better at deciding than I was." Corbett thought about that. He thought about what Gareth had done with the first portion of the money, the 40 acres he had bought to keep a family on their land. He thought about the farm crisis spreading through Dawson County right now, the foreclosure notices and the equipment auctions, and the families who had farmed the same ground for 2 and 3 generations and were losing it in a single bad cycle. He knew what Gareth Alcott would have done. More importantly, he knew what his father would have done. And Cornelia had been right. He had known since he read the letter. He put the truck in gear and drove home. The $3,200 went into a separate account that same week. Corbett spent November and December of 1985 doing something that looked to any who noticed like an unusual amount of driving around the county. He was visiting families, quietly without announcement, asking questions and listening carefully to the answers, not offering anything yet, just learning what was true. Burl Van Buren was the first person he helped. Burl's machine shop had survived the early years of the crisis on the strength of repair work, farmers fixing old equipment rather than buying new, which should have been good for a mechanic. But Burl had borrowed to expand the shop in 1981, had taken on a second bay and a new lathe on the assumption that the good years would continue, and when they did not, the loan payments became a monthly emergency. He was 3 months behind. The bank had sent its first formal notice. Corbett drove to Burl's shop on a Tuesday in January of 1986. He set an envelope on Burl's workbench. Inside was $400 in cash. Burl looked at the envelope without touching it. Then he looked at Corbett. "There is no explanation that makes this simple," Corbett said. "A man I never met left something behind that was meant to help people who needed it. You need it right now. That is the full story." Burl picked up the envelope. He turned it over in his hands. This was not a comfortable moment for either of them, and both of them knew it because they had spent years on opposite sides of a transaction, Burl trying to buy something Corbett would not sell, and the reversal of positions required some adjustment. "I don't take charity," Burl said. "It is not charity. It is one man's attempt 30 years late to make a wrong thing slightly more right. You are just the address where that attempt arrived." Burl was quiet for a moment. Then who was he? The man who left it. "His name was Gareth Alcott. He owned the machine before I did." Burl looked at the envelope again, and something shifted in his expression, a recognition of a chain of events longer and stranger than either of them had anticipated when they stood arguing in an auction lot in 1969. He put the envelope in his shirt pocket. "Tell me the rest of it sometime," he said. "Buy me coffee and I will." They shook hands. It was the first time they had shaken hands in 17 years of knowing each other, and it felt like the closing of something that had been open too long. The land deed took longer. The legal process of transferring a deed held in the name of a man dead for 33 years, with no direct heirs present in the state, and a complex chain of historical title required nearly a year of patient work by Robert Garfield's office in Lincoln. Corbett drove to Lincoln 4 times, signed documents on 3 separate occasions, and received in the spring of 1987 a clean title to 40 acres of Frontier County farmland in his own name. He drove out to Frontier County on a Saturday in April. The land was there exactly as described in the deed, 40 acres of productive bottomland along a creek drainage sitting fallow, because no one had farmed it since the last of the Garner family had died in the early 1970s. It was good land. You could see it was good land without doing anything except walking the edge of it and looking at the color of the soil and the way the drainage ran. Gareth Alcott had known what he was buying. Even in his guilt and his confusion, he had chosen well. It was shortly after the deed transfer that Corbett received a phone call he had not expected. The voice on the line was a woman's, measured and direct. She introduced herself as Dorothea Alcott, and she said she was Gareth Alcott's great niece, the granddaughter of Gareth's younger brother living in Denver and working as an accountant. She had heard through the network of small county record searches and title transfers that are never entirely private that someone in Dawson County had been researching Gareth Alcott's name in connection with a property matter. She wanted to know why. Corbett asked her to come to Lexington. She arrived 3 days later in a rental car, a woman of 52 with gray beginning at her temples in the careful eyes of someone accustomed to reading numbers and finding the discrepancies that other people miss. She sat at Corbett's kitchen table, and he put the letter and the deed in front of her and told her everything. She read the letter slowly. Her face did not remain neutral. She had come prepared, he could see, to be businesslike about this, to assess the situation and determine what belonged to the Alcott family and what did not. The letter did not cooperate with that preparation. By the third page, she had stopped trying to maintain her composure, and by the fourth page, she was not crying so much as experiencing something too large for the expression she had prepared. When she finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "He was a thief. He was a frightened man who made a wrong choice and spent the rest of his life trying to correct it with the tools he had." Those aren't mutually exclusive. No, they're not. She looked at the money still in its leather pouch on the table. "I want that," she said. Her voice was level, but he could hear the effort, the levelness required. "I know," Corbett said. "You don't have a legal claim to it. Gareth's letter and the circumstances of its discovery give me full legal standing. I've had it confirmed in writing. He was my family." He was. And he hid this in a machine he then let go to auction, with no instructions to anyone, with no provision for his wife or his family to find it. He put it somewhere a stranger would find it, not because he was thoughtless, but because he could not face giving it directly to the people who knew him. That is what the letter says when you read it carefully. Dorothea Alcott sat with that for a long moment. Outside the window, the Fairfax fields stretched toward the tree line, green and ordered under the spring sky. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. "There are families in this county who are losing land they have farmed for generations. The same thing your great-uncle used the first portion of this money to prevent." He paused. "Gareth Alcott spent his life trying to make one thing right. I intend to spend this money finishing what he started." The silence that followed was the silence of someone recalculating something fundamental. Dorothea Alcott looked at her hands on the table. "I came here to claim something for my family," she said. "I am going to leave here having learned that my family is more complicated and more human than I knew." She was quiet another moment. "I don't want the money. I want the names of the families you help, so I can tell my children that their great-great-uncle was a man who made a terrible mistake and then spent the rest of his life and his last resources trying to correct it." She looked up. "That is a different story than thief." "It is," Corbett said, "and it's the true one." She drove back to Denver the next morning, and twice a year after that at Thanksgiving. And in the spring, she called Corbett to ask how many families the money had reached. He told her the number each time. It grew slowly, one family at a time, stretching over several years until the last of the $3,200 had found its destination. The Frontier County land sold in the early 1990s, 20 acres, to a young farmer named Floyd Ulrich, whose father had lost his operation in the crisis. The other 20 added to the Fairfax farm and eventually passed to Corbett's daughter, who used her portion to start her own operation in Kansas. Floyd Ulrich was 23 years old and trying to begin from nothing when Corbett met him. He reminded Corbett of no one in particular, which was perhaps why he reminded Corbett of himself, because what he recognized was not a face or a manner, but a specific quality of determination that has no vanity in it, the kind that does not need an audience, the kind that simply continues. Corbett sold him the 20 acres at market price, but guaranteed the loan, personally pledging his own land as collateral so that a bank would finance a young man with no history and no assets. When Floyd asked why, Corbett thought for a moment before answering. Because someone a long time ago chose to do one right thing with resources that had come to him the wrong way. That choice has been moving through time ever since landing where it needed to land. Right now it needs to land with you. Floyd did not fully understand this. He would understand it better later when Corbett eventually told him the full story of Gareth Alcott and the machine in the hidden room. But he accepted it the way young people accept things that are larger than their current framework, by holding them carefully until the framework grows large enough to accommodate them. The 1948 Farmall M sold at the Dawson County auction in the spring of 1989, 20 years after Corbett had bought it for $75 in the same lot. He had decided to sell it the previous winter, standing in the workshop on a January evening, looking at the machine that had taught him everything he knew about persistence and patience, and the willingness to take something apart completely to understand what it contained. He had kept it for 2 decades, and he knew why he had kept it, and he also knew that the reason for keeping it had changed. In the beginning, he had kept it because it needed him. Then he had kept it because he needed it. Now, for the first time, neither of those things was true. It had given him everything it had to give. The right thing was to let it give something to someone else. Burl Van Buren bid it up to $9,000 before stopping. When the hammer came down at $12,500, Burl found Corbett at the edge of the crowd and shook his head slowly. "I was trying to buy back the thing I tried to steal from you in 1969, he said. "I know. You didn't need to let that go for $12,500. There were collectors in that room who would have gone to $15,000. $12,500 was enough," Corbett said. "I didn't need to win, I just needed to finish." Burl looked at him for a moment. Then he laughed a short, genuine sound and walked away shaking his head. Leland Mercer found Corbett after the crowd had thinned. He was 67 years old, and he had sold his dealership a few years earlier to settle debts from the farm crisis, and he had spent the intervening years in the diminished, quieter life of a man who had learned late that the confidence he had carried for decades was partly substance and partly performance, and had needed time to sort out which was which. They sat on a wooden bench at the edge of the auction lot in the same general area where 20 years earlier, Leland had planted himself in Corbett's path and delivered his assessment of $75 spent poorly. "Tell me something," Leland said. "All those years, the engine running the machine, working the reputation you built. What was it actually about, not the machine? What were you proving?" Corbett considered this honestly, the way Leland was asking it honestly, as a genuine question from a man who had spent years thinking about the difference between the thing people do and the reason they do it. "Nothing," Corbett said. "I wasn't proving anything. I was learning something. There is a difference." "What were you learning?" "That the value of a thing is not determined by what the room full of people says when the auctioneer holds it up." He watched the Iowa collector's trailer move slowly toward the exit with the Farmall M secured on it. "My father tried to teach me that. I had to find it myself the way you find most things worth knowing." Leland was quiet for a moment, then, "That machine had a secret in it." "It did. You found it." "In 1985. Leland turned to look at him. "You never told anyone." "I told the people who needed to know." "Sit with me here a while," Leland said, "and tell me about Gareth Alcott." So Corbett told him the whole story, from the letter to the hidden room to Dorothea Alcott's drive from Denver to Floyd Ulrich's 20 acres now producing corn 3 counties away. Leland listened without speaking. He was the kind of man who, when he finally learned to listen, listened completely. When Corbett finished, Leland sat for a long time looking at the empty lot where the Farmall M had stood that morning. He hid the worst thing he had ever done inside the best thing he had ever built, Leland said finally. And then he trusted a stranger he would never meet to find it and know what to do. Yes, that takes a kind of faith I don't think I've ever had. Corbett thought about that. I think Gareth wasn't faithful by nature. I think he was desperate. He had made a mistake he couldn't fix directly, and the only thing he could do was create the conditions for someone else to fix it. And he had to die not knowing whether it would work. He paused. That is actually harder than faith. That is putting something good into the world and walking away. Leland Mercer extended his hand. Corbett shook it. It was the first time the handshake between them had meant something other than transaction. That evening, Corbett drove home as the light was going orange across the fields. He pulled into the farm road and stopped the truck at the gate the way he sometimes stopped to look at the land before driving the last quarter mile to the house. The fields were planted. The equipment shed held machines in good order. The workshop still had his father's tools on the wall, organized the same way Garland Fairfax had arranged them, a habit Corbett had never seen any reason to change. Cornelia was on the porch with her evening tea. She had slowed down in recent years, as people do, but she was still sharp, still watching, still holding the quality of attentiveness that had characterized her Corbett's whole life. He sat down beside her. The fields went gold, then amber, then a deep blue-gray as the light left them. "You sold it," she said. 12,500. Your father would not have believed that number. He would have believed everything that led to it. Cornelia set her cup down. "Corbett, do you know what I am most proud of in all of it?" He looked at her. "Not that you fixed the machine, not that you found what was inside it, not even that you did right by Gareth Alcott's money." She looked at the fields. "I am most proud that you never needed anyone to tell you you were right in order to keep doing the right thing. That is the rarest quality I have ever seen in a person. Your father had it. You have it. I do not have it myself, and I have lived my whole life admiring it in the two of you." Corbett did not answer because there was no answer that would not have diminished what she had said. He sat beside his mother on the porch and watched the light finish leaving the fields, and he thought about Gareth Alcott sealing a letter in wax in November of 1952 and hiding it in the dark inside an engine he was about to lose, trusting the machine to carry it to the right hands. He thought about $75 on a Saturday morning, about a man in a clean shirt who said it was foolishness, about 3 years of evenings in a coal workshop turning problems over until they became solutions, about an engine firing for the first time in 20 years while frost was still on the windows, about a letter that began, "I do not know who will find this." Gareth Alcott had died without knowing, and that, Corbett thought, sitting in the cooling evening with his mother beside him and the farm around them both, was what made the whole thing matter. Not that Gareth had done the right thing in the end, not that Corbett had found it and carried it forward, but that Gareth had put it into the world without knowing, without guarantee, without any assurance at all, except the belief that the machine would find its way to the right person. That belief had held for 33 years inside a sealed crankcase. It had held because it was true. The Farmall M is in a museum in Iowa, now restored and displayed and running still, and visitors stop beside it the way people stop beside things that have outlasted the context that made them uncertain what they are looking at, but sensing that it is more than a machine. The placard beside it gives the basic facts: year of manufacture, original owner, restoration history, selling price at auction. It does not mention Gareth Alcott. It does not mention the hidden compartment or the leather pouch or the 4 pages of confession sealed in wax for 3 decades. It does not mention Corbett Fairfax standing in a barn in October of 1985 with his hands not entirely steady, cutting through a weld that someone else had laid down 33 years before. Corbett kept the letter. He reads it sometimes on winter evenings when the farm is quiet and the work is done, and there is time to sit with things that deserve more than a passing thought. He reads Gareth Alcott's careful handwriting, and he thinks about a man he never met who made a terrible mistake and could not undo it and could not live with it and found in the end only one narrow path towards something that was not quite peace but was at least not silence. He thinks about $75, about how the auctioneer almost did not bother to call it, about how 200 people laughed and a dealer in a clean shirt said it was foolishness, and a man with a business card offered $40 for the scrap. None of them were wrong about what the machine looked like. They were only wrong about what it contained. And that Corbett has come to understand is the real lesson of the whole long story. Not that hidden treasures are real, though sometimes they are. Not that persistence defeats mockery, though sometimes it does. The lesson is simpler and harder than either of those things. The lesson is that the value of what you are looking at is almost never visible on the surface. That the most important things are sealed inside, waiting for someone patient enough and stubborn enough and thorough enough to take the whole thing apart to the end. That a rusted machine in the corner of an auction lot and a dying man's last attempt at decency and a 22-year-old with $75 in small bills can be, if the right person shows up at the right moment with the right quality of attention, exactly enough. Gareth Alcott hoped for someone like that. He found one.